Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Ariel Seidman, the founder of Hivemapper. Ariel was actually the first interview that I ever did on this podcast, and I've been watching Hivemapper ever since, and it's been fascinating to see how they have grown and changed throughout the years. So I thought I'd invite Ariel back on to give us an update. We cover a lot of ground on this episode, and I'm not going to go into all of the details here in the introduction, but I think you're going to enjoy this. And just as a quick note, I ask all companies featured on this podcast to help contribute to creating their episode and to running the podcast. Some say no, some say yes. And Ariel and Hivemapper said yes. So I really appreciate your support, Ariel, Hivemapper. Thank you very much. By helping cover the cost of your episode, you help cover the cost of all of the episodes that are produced. So I really appreciate your support. Thank you. There'll be links in the show notes to Hivemapper, but of course you can just Google Hivemapper and you'll find it. It's worth checking out. It really is. It's a fascinating project. It's an interesting idea. And although we talk about it in a lot of detail in this podcast episode, again, it's worth checking out. It's worth seeing it for yourself. Okay, let's get into the interview. Ariel, welcome back to the podcast. You were my first ever podcast guest way back in 2019. At that stage, and still now, you're the founder of something called Hivemapper. And I remember Hivemapper was a super interesting project back then. It's evolved somewhat since last time we talked. You were mainly focused on drones, terrain models, that kind of thing. And now you're at a very different space. But before we dive into all that great stuff around what Hivemapper is now and how we got there, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself, please, to the audience?
Sure. My name is Ariel Seidman. I've been in and around mapping large-scale data collection systems since really my first job out of school, which is Yahoo. Goes back to like 2004, 2005 timeframe. So I sat in the search group at Yahoo. We still had at that point like 30% market share versus Google. They had like maybe 32, 35%. So we were still very competitive with them. And I looked after first all local data that was feeding into the search engine because roughly 25% of all queries had some sort of local geo dimension to them. And then I ultimately ran Yahoo Maps, and I kind of had a very early and excellent seat to kind of see how Google Maps was getting built in that time frame. Quite frankly, they kicked our ass because they committed large amounts of capital and technology and systems to be collecting data from the physical world at a huge scale. And so as they did that, they just got better and better than we did. And Yahoo was unfortunately not willing to commit that kind of capital to that business. And so it is, to me, fast forward to 2024, Google become massive. They then acquired Waze, which was kind of a very interesting competitor to them in a lot of ways. And so I think there's a lot of parts of the world and many countries that are entirely reliant on Google Maps. And if Google Maps were to stop updating or just get pulled from that country, the GDP of that country would actually suffer as a result of that. And so there aren't that many choices in terms of large scale global maps. You can count them, maybe one or two or three at max. And in some countries, only one. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background.
Wow, and I think that says a lot about you too, what you're interested in, where your focus is as well as telling us what your history is and where you came from. And give me a comparison between then and now in terms of Hivemapper. So last time we talked, or the first time we talked, Hivemapper was again focused on drones, and what is it now?
So the mission or the vision of Hivemapper has always been the same, which is like, how do you build this new large scale global map, right, from the ground up? And so we started off, with drones. And so the idea was drones had this very unique perspective on the world. Most of the times data collection systems, they're either airborne data collection systems, obviously like satellites or airplanes, which give you kind of that top down view, or they're street level, right? So Google Street View program is something we're all familiar with, street level, or even, just GPS motion data from like Waze and stuff like that. And those are two separate systems. And so I really thought what was interesting about drones was they fly very low to the ground, right? Like, 100, 200 feet above ground level. And so they give you not 100% of both ground level and airborne level or aerial level, but they give you a lot of both, right? And it was like, okay, that's like a 2-for-1 almost. And that's really interesting and that's really compelling. The core issue that hurt our ability to really scale that, we built like a whole system, right? You like utilize a DJI drone, it would like all the data would flow. We'd kind of build out this map one piece at a time, and they would all kind of connect with one another, which was kind of cool. And so that whole software stack actually got built behind that. But what was an issue for us was two things. One is the battery technology on drones never really dramatically improved. So a DJI drone, a commercial drone that you bought for like $1,000 back then, could maybe fly for 35, 40 minutes max. And that is generally still the case today. And so that's a real problem because you need the experience to be very passive. And if you like launch a drone, pull it back after 35 minutes, you have to swap the batteries. That is not passive at all. Then number two issue was legal. Like every little city had their own regulations and laws related to drones. And there were no federal laws, and we just didn't see federal laws happening anytime soon. And so we're like, yeah, you know what? Like, we're going to put drones to the side and go down to street level. And we then kind of iterated our way through a bunch of different approaches at street level until we finally got to the approach that is working and scaling today.
Okay, so let's talk about that approach that's working and scaling today. And then I think that'll open the door to some interesting conversation with why is that working as opposed to the other things you've tried. So where are we today in terms of collecting street level mapping data at a global scale?
So we tried iPhones and Android devices. There's other projects like, that I have a lot of respect for, like Maplery that did the iPhone, Android. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We tried third-party dash cams as well. We even tried like very expensive systems, external mounted like 3D camera systems, etc. And we ultimately decided to go build our own device. And so if you look at the world as it stands today, iPhone, Android devices, they're not passive at all. Okay. You have to mount unless you buy a separate phone for the purposes of mapping, that means is you're taking your one and only phone and putting on your windshield, which by the way gets very, very hot in the middle of the summer. And then every single time you get into the car, you have to mount it, open up the app and hit play. That's a tremendous amount of friction. And so what we saw very quickly was people would just churn out of the systems, right? And oftentimes, especially during the summer, people would just like stop mapping because the phone would very quickly overheat. They're just fundamentally not designed for that. And then in addition to that, let's assume for a second you can get the entire thing passive, which you really can't. The positioning technology inside of an iPhone or Android device is pretty bad. It's just not built for mapping, right? And so you're literally off by like anywhere between like 3 meters up to like 15 meters in some cases. So that's a massive issue. So that's iPhone, Android device. Then we tried third-party dash cams. Some of the third-party dash cams were better in the sense that every time you got into the vehicle, it would just automatically start recording, right? So good. That's a big win, obviously. But there were the positioning technology on most dash cams, actually not most dash cams, all dash cams. It's okay if you're just doing some basic like fleet monitoring stuff, but if you're trying to build a map, it's atrocious. Then the compute on those devices, you don't really have access to, right? So if you want to be running your own models to detect objects, position objects, basically build the map, you can't really get access to those because this is like a proprietary system or somebody else's. And even you hack into it, it kind of, it gets very, very messy very, very quickly. And then you need to offload all the data, right? So you need some sort of comp, either Wi-Fi or better yet, LTE to be able to offload all the data. And a lot of these third-party devices either didn't have that or it was really poor or like we couldn't gain access to it or whatever. So we're like, okay, we're going to bite the bullet here and we're going to go build our own hardware. The first device that we built was atrocious. It looked really ugly, but it actually solved all of those issues. Well, it didn't actually solve the comms issue, right? The comms issue, like we were still doing it via Wi-Fi. We did not have LTE on the first device, but we're like, okay, we can add that. That's pretty straightforward, but it definitely solved. It was entirely passive. It could map at a very, very high level of precision. We had total control over it. So we're like, okay, this works. And we actually got it working in 3 different countries. We got it working in Lagos, Nigeria. So we built about 60 of the first device, 20 in LA, 20 in Lagos, Nigeria, and 20 were deployed to Philippines or Manila. And it worked. And it was like, we lit up Manila so incredibly quickly. We're like, okay, there's something really powerful here. This is pretty cool. And then we're like, okay, let's go build our second one. And at that point, we figured out like, okay, we want to like from an incentive perspective, how are we going to like incentivize? And we were paying people at this time like cash, like small amounts of cash. Sending cash to places like Lagos, Nigeria, and the Philippines is really, really complicated. And so the people in the Philippines actually said, hey, can you just send us like crypto, like Ethereum or whatever? And we're like, why? And they're like, well, we get the money faster. And I said, okay, explain this to me. And they say, look, if you send us through PayPal, whatever, we get paid on a Sunday, we don't get the cash till like Thursday or Friday, right? It has to go through all these whatever processes on their side. And then, but if you just give us Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever at the time, then we can just like literally cash it out like within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. Okay. And we can like pay for gas, pay for groceries. And they showed me the app and I was like, that's pretty cool. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. That's cool. And then we saw this other project that was doing something that was on the blockchain that was effectively incentivizing the creation. In their case, they're building out a mobile wireless infrastructure, right? So they need these people to deploy all these like hotspots. And it was working for them. And I said, well, that's pretty similar to kind of what we need, right? We need people to deploy all these, camera systems in all these vehicles all over the world. That's really interesting. Anyways, long story short is we raised 21 million, $22 million, had enough capital to kind of go build the next two versions of the device. And then fast forward to 1 year after launch, we had mapped 10% of the global road network. Fast
Wow.
forward 2 years after launch, we've now mapped about 28% of the global road network.
Wow. I guess we're seeing hotspots around the major cities as well, or within, urban areas.
So as not to confuse people in terms of projects. So Helium is this other project that is doing like a mobile wireless. So that's their project, that's their thing. That's how they have a separate incentive mechanism. When we launched Hivemapper with this crypto blockchain based token called Honey, which is ours, it's a totally separate incentive system. It has nothing to do with Helium, but we were very much inspired kind of by what they were doing and their approach to solving this kind of bootstrapping problem, right? Fundamentally, it's like, how do you bootstrap the network? And so that's what that mechanism helped us do. But look, that mechanism doesn't really work unless the technology and the product is entirely passive. So they kind of have to all fit together.
And again, if you're trying to build something at a global scale, you need things that scale to global, right? And like PayPal wasn't doing it for you, sending cash wasn't doing it for you. So you needed to move to something else. So it makes a lot of sense. Interesting too that people were driving that. People were saying, hey, why don't you look in this direction? And then you listen to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a ton to dive in here, but I want to try and recap a little bit, like going back to why you moved away from drones, why you moved away from these other sensors that you tried, phones being one of them, and other dash cams being. So for me, it was that they weren't passive. So there was a lot of work involved. A phone was very active. I had to go into my car, hook it up, download it, upload it, I guess, the information. It got really hot. And it was also using a device that I kind of use all the time as well. Drones, you were running out of battery power. And again, I guess there was no onboard compute. So you couldn't compute anything, which meant, I guess, the comms was an issue, trying to get that data down off it and upload it to somewhere else. That must have been a bit of a headache. I can imagine the same thing being true for the dash cams. And also you had that positioning problem where the positioning, they're not built for positioning. They're built for capturing data in a passive way. But again, you had no access to the compute on board. So I guess someone had to take a chip and upload it, download it, or something like that. So you built your own system, which is a big gamble. I think people say all the time, hardware is hard, and you gambled. But you said once you deployed these first 60 units to these different spots around the world, the map lit up. And did you know immediately, okay, we are on the right path, we need to do more of this stuff? Or were you still like, were you still sort of in doubt?
No, at that point, I mean, I knew it was going to work. I think you develop a feel for this kind of stuff after a while of like what's working and what's not working and what to kind of double down on. But like I knew that we had solved the passive thing. I knew hardware was the right approach. And I was like pretty sure the incentive mechanism that we had was going to work as well. And then so going into the launch, I was very confident. And then obviously, like when I start to see the initial numbers, I was like, okay, this is obviously working. And then I was actually like, okay, how do we actually make the hardware product even better? And so this latest device that we're going to start shipping here in the next month or two, that device is called the B, and it is 10 times better than the device that we launched with back in November of 2022. And it will, the version after the B obviously will only get better. Like, I'm a big believer. I forgot who said this, but I think the quote goes something like, people who are serious about software build their own hardware. And it never really made a ton of sense to me, because like you could build so many cool things right in a browser, on mobile apps, whatever. But now that I've experienced this for myself, where when we built the right hardware combined with the right software, it just fundamentally solves the experience, right? It creates the grounds for us to really grow and grow rapidly and solve this underlying problem.
That's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about how the sensor works. So we've got the positioning there. Your people are buying these things. They're putting them in the cars. They're driving around town. Where do we go from there? What's happening? So they're taking video footage and then.
So let's talk about the sensors that are on it, because that's pretty important, right? A lot of people will say like, oh, iPhones have cameras. Okay, well, why can't you do this with an iPhone, right? It's true. iPhones does have a camera. It's actually a very good camera, but that camera is designed for the purposes of, quite frankly, like selfies, right? Or like just taking a picture of you and your friends, or, your kids, or whatever it is. And they actually like do like a lot of processing on the actual underlying imagery that is not great for the purposes of mapping. So in our case, we have three different cameras. So there's the main imager camera, which is a fairly wide angle camera, very high resolution. That main camera combined with a compute module that we have is detecting objects. So it's like, okay, that's a speed limit sign, stop sign, turn restriction, that's the ground, that's the street, there's this many lanes, that kind of stuff. But there, all you then have is these objects. You have rough positioning because the device has a sense of where it's located, but it doesn't mean that knows where that object is located. And so we then have stereo depth cameras with a fairly wide baseline, so that they're far apart from one another. And the simple way to explain a stereo depth camera is it operates like your eyes, right? Because you have two eyes, you're actually seeing like a three-dimensional scene, and you can get a sense of space. You have a spatial awareness. And so with that stereo depth camera, we're able to then very precisely position objects, right? Down to like 25 centimeters, 50 centimeters, maybe a max of about a meter. So that is incredibly powerful capability.
Does that depend on the distance from, like the distance the object is from the sensor?
Yes.
Or is that
yes.
every object within a scene?
Sorry, what was the other part?
I'm just wondering, like,
Yeah.
Does that positioning accuracy that you're talking about, which was really, really impressive, does that depend on the distance the object is from the sensor? When the image is taken,
Yeah.
is it within a radius of, I don't know, 40, 50
Yeah.
meters of the sensor, or is it every object within the scene?
Okay, yeah, so good question. So it's dependent upon a couple of things, right? So first of all, it also requires that the device know where it's located, right? So the positional accuracy of the device itself is obviously really critical. We use a very, I would say, high-end-ish GNSS module or GPS module. This is the kind of module that you would definitely not be in most smartphones. Like, this is 2 or 3 notches above that. But it's also combined with an antenna, a GNSS antenna, which is quite large, right? So the antenna that we have is 5 to 10 times larger than most antennas on most smartphones, right? So it's a very large GNSS antenna. Then you combine it with IMU and compass and visual odometry and an understanding of where the device is in the vehicle, like how high above the ground is, its yaw, and all that kind of stuff. Then we're able to position that device, not 100% of the time, but in most scenarios, we're able to position the device down to roughly 50 centimeters positional accuracy, sometimes better, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And so now, okay, so let's say you have 50 centimeters positional accuracy on the device itself, right? And then you detect, just make it simple, a stop sign. The stop sign is 3 to, let's call it 20 meters from the device, anywhere within that range. We can very consistently get that sign positioned, detected and positioned down to like 50 centimeters positional accuracy. If it's beyond that, let's say it's like 30 meters or 50 meters, obviously we probably won't be able to get that down to 50 centimeters. Now, it does improve with more people seeing it, right? So
Yeah.
if there's like a really, really far sign, right, like off the side of a highway, the more people see it, then you can start to like get a little bit better. But look, most objects, your vehicle is going to pass them at some point, right? Not 100% of objects, but a lot of objects, your vehicle is going to pass them. And when they does pass it, it'll probably pass it at a range of on the low end 1 to 2 meters all the way up to like 10 or 15 meters. And that's all great. We can do a lot with that.
Yeah, in my mind, I'm looking at a road network and putting a buffer of 10, 15, 20 meters around it, and that's a lot of surface area you're seeing.
That really speaks to the wide baseline that we have combined with the resolution of the depth stereo cameras. Like the combination of those two things enables us to see and position objects much, much further away.
Yeah, cool. So, what kind of objects are important to you? What do you really want to get out of this imagery?
So I think there's like two broad categories. There's what I would refer to as like route intelligence. So that's all the things that impact navigation. So, we want to understand how many lanes there are, if there's any special, so lane definition, anything, special about a certain lane, speed limit signs, stop signs, turn restriction signs, names of streets, highway exit signs, all of that, toll price, signs, all of that type of stuff, right? That all impacts your ability to move and do it efficiently and safely and all that kind of stuff. So that's one category. That's the highest priority category. Then there's what we refer to commonly as like location intelligence, where we're trying to understand something about a very specific location, right? We want to know that, hey, the coffee shop over there is called whatever, Phil's Coffee, and it's still open. Okay. So, we want to be able to see that that's Phil's Coffee, where it's located, all that. And then we're trying to understand information that will tell us that like, hey, that coffee shop is still open. So if they have umbrellas right out by it, or if there's people walking in and out of it, we can determine that business that Phil's Coffee is still open, right? So that's location intelligence. Or you can even say like, hey, there's road construction here by the Phil's Coffee. And so then you can start to say, oh, wow, if there's like a lot of road construction next to all of these Phil's Coffees, maybe Phil's Coffee as a retail business is going to start to like suffer as a result of that because they're not going to get as much street, just, traffic, people coming in. So that's what we refer to as like location intelligence. That's interesting to us. It's an interesting market, but it's definitely like secondary to routing and route intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, for both of those scenarios there, for both those data sets that you're collecting, do you use third-party data sets to confirm or deny, like almost as a source of ground truth? Hey, you say there's a stop sign there. I'm thinking about OpenStreetMap, for example. You said there's a stop sign there. Is that part of it, or do you rely completely on your own data?
Yeah, for all that stuff, we rely only on us. I mean, we have the imagery at the end of the day, right? So we have like this AI trainer system. These are human beings who can go in there and confirm whether or not that, in fact, is a stop sign and confirm the positional accuracy of it. So I would argue that we have the data to best confirm whether or not what we're collecting is true or not. So from that perspective, we don't use third party data. But no, we're not opposed to like, for example, places, right? Like we do not have, and I don't think OpenStreetMap, quite frankly, has a good places data set. They do a lot of other good things, but like places is not their strong suit. And so like places, that's something that we would maybe use a third party for to kind of, bootstrap our data and then expand it beyond there.
We talked about edge processing before, and so one of the reasons you built your own device was so you can process things on the edge.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you're only like that you're filtering out the data very, very heavily on edge, and then just sending a fraction of it off to your servers?
Yeah.
And the reason I'm asking or curious about this is because I think about the future. Because if you're quote unquote throwing away bits of data now, can you what does that mean for the future? Does that mean that you're limited to the objects you're detecting on edge now today, or is there some way of, or what kind of data you're sending back to your service?
Yeah. So let's separate those. There's kind of two questions in there. So I'll separate them just so the first is, the firmware that is and the software that's running on the B device or any of our devices is always being updated, right? So if we start to say, hey, we want to start detecting, I don't know, billboard signs, right? That's a fairly straightforward process to then update the software that's running on all the devices. to start including the detection capabilities for outdoor billboard ads. So we can expand that, and we always are expanding that, quite frankly.
But that wouldn't be backwards compatible then.
No, no, yeah, obviously we would not be backwards compatible. But we're seeing enough of the world constantly that it's not really an issue in most markets for us. Like, if you take a given intersection, let's say in Phoenix, Arizona, we're probably seeing that, I don't know, 180 to 300 times per week. Sorry,
Wow.
per year.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
And so it's just a lot, right? Like, yes, and what we are doing now is, historically, we're actually uploading all the imagery. That's a lot of imagery, right? And we were actually, like, day 0, we were processing it on AWS. Now we're off of that, and we're doing it on the B device, and even some of the early devices, we're doing the mapping and the detections there, so we're only sending up the relevant imagery and the detections that we want. Like, even if, so for example, we see the speed limit sign, we map it, we position it, it's 35 miles an hour. If there's no change to it tomorrow, the next day, whatever it is, then we'll just say, yep, we saw it, same, same. Like, we're not
Right.
even like uploading like very, yeah. So you got to be very, very efficient about what you actually upload for two reasons. One is, LTE or Wi-Fi is, it's not limitless, right? And then from an AWS perspective, you then have a bandwidth and storage cost. And so both of those can add up pretty quickly at the scale that we're now operating at.
So that makes a lot of sense, but I'm imagining that the problem of detecting meaningful change is tough.
It is. Yeah.
So I'm thinking if the weather condition was different, like, oh, I can see the sign, but has it changed in a meaningful way? Maybe I can only see half of it, for example, and that must be a hard problem to solve.
It is. Yeah. Like, the device operates in kind of different modes. So what it basically does is it says, okay, I have a hypothesis about this intersection, right? As an example, at this intersection, there should be 4 stop signs, right? Stop sign at every corner. Or, a more complex one would be like a intersection with like traffic lights and turn restrictions, right? So it develops a hypothesis of how many signs should be there, right? Once it's developed and kind of confirmed its hypothesis about how many given signs at any given intersection, then it'll go into kind of what we refer to more as change detection mode. So it's much more looking for changes relative to its current understanding of what that intersection or what that location looks like. And that actually enables the device to be a little bit more compute efficient when it goes into that change detection mode.
That is that's really interesting. I think as edge computing becomes more and more popular, more and more common, I think we're going to see a lot of really interesting solutions around that. How do you deal with things like dynamic pricing on bridges or roadways or dynamic signage in general?
Yeah. The world is very much headed in that kind of that dynamic, right? I mean, in Europe, for example, there's a lot of dynamic speed limit signs, obviously dynamic toll pricing, so I think that's going to become even more and more prevalent, and they are tough to deal with or interesting to deal with just because they're constantly changing. But look, we deal with the same way. Like, we can read a toll price sign, so for example, here in San Francisco Bay Area, the express lanes are now have a toll price associated to them, and it's dynamic, right? Like, between this section and that section, it's like $9 now, or like it's $7, right? And that actually affects some of our customers, especially those that are in the logistics business, right? Or in some cases, it's like, hey, if you have a truck, boom, and you have X number of axles, you're paying this much. It doesn't matter about like what lane you're in. And that can also be dynamic as well. And so it has huge implications for a lot of these like commercial transportation logistic companies. But we deal with it in the same way, right? It's just like we can read it, we can see it, we can update it, all that type of stuff.
Are you now, or can you get to the stage where you can start to model this? Oh, we can see that the pricing goes up here, and we can make some estimates look out into the future and make estimates based on your data and say, we estimate that the pricing at this time of the day, at this location could be X.
Good question. We probably have enough data to do it. We haven't done it yet as the short version. Maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the products that we're building and who's using them, because I think unless there was other topics you want to cover in terms of the supply side and how the data gets built and all that type of stuff.
We will definitely get there, definitely, because that's a really important piece of the conversation. I want to know a little bit more about the platform. So obviously this is not obviously, but this is happening in a car, which makes a lot of sense. It's a big, stable object with a ton of power, and it moves around the world in a very, very structured way. Could you imagine that your platform, the sensor, being on other platforms, bikes, scooters, I don't know, other things, pedestrians maybe?
Yeah. So right now we like the horizontal platform that a vehicle provides us with, and we also like fairly taller vehicles. So like delivery vans and trucks are great as well because they get a slightly better view of the road, quite frankly, than like very, very low cars. But once we make a big push for Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of motorcycles and other types of vehicles that tend to be like small, maybe even like I forgot what we call it. What are the three-wheeled vehicles in many parts of Southeast Asia, like rickshaws or
Ah,
something like that?
yeah.
Anyways, I'm embarrassed to say I forgot the name, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. That kind of vehicle does become important. Now, there's different challenges from a technology perspective because it's not a horizontally stable platform. It is a little bit more challenging to map. It's not a impossible problem, but it's definitely a little bit more software engineering work that needs to go inside on our side. There is this other issue, especially on a motorcycle or a bike, I should say, a power. What is the power source for the device? So, it would have to have a, non-trivial battery. The device pulls about 7 watts. So it would have to be, a meaningful size battery if you were to include it. So the short version is like it is not the type of thing that we're going to solve in the next like 12 to 18 months. We have bigger, like higher priority stuff that we have to solve, but it is solvable and it's pretty interesting.
Could you name one of those higher priorities for us, please, just before we move on and talk about the data itself?
Yeah, so it's really like right now it's very much on like the customers and the data products and the solutions in terms of how they use them, right? I think
Perfect
historically,
segue.
yeah. Like historically, this data. So, all right, let me back up here. There's really like there's three broad markets that I think are pretty interesting. All right. I'll talk about what those three markets are, and then I'll talk about the three products that we're building currently, and then the ones that we'll build in the future. So, look, I think there's three broad markets. One is other businesses. So, this would be like competitive with Google Maps API business, right? Where you're selling to, the likes of Uber, Lyft, FedEx, other mapping companies, transportation logistic companies, local governments, travel places, commercial real estate, residential real estate. They all use maps in a variety of ways and they pay Google today a lot of money for that data. So that's number 1. Number 2 is automotive. I'm not talking about the infotainment, the maps that reside in the infotainment system. That's not a massive market. What is a very interesting market is maps that feed into autonomous systems, autonomous driving systems, whether that be level 2. So that would be something like a Ford Blue Cruise product, which can take over driving in certain scenarios, all the way up to like a robotaxi. So there we're probably competitive with something like Mobilize REM product, road experience management data product, which is effectively like a map they've built. And so that's the second large category. The third large category is in the consumer navigation. Now, we do not yet have like in other than 3 or 4 markets, we do not yet have the density needed to build all the layers of the consumer navigation map. Once we do, then I think we can build something very, very interesting. And the fundamental reason why is what Google and Waze have is just motion, right? They can tell you, okay, based upon these GPS traces, most people on this road are going 10 miles an hour, and historically they've gone 45 miles an hour. There must be a problem, right? But with the advent of eyes and this intelligent camera system, we understand exactly what's going on, right? And there's a big difference between, hey, there's road construction that's going to be on this road for the next 6 months or 2 months or 2 weeks versus like, it's just a little bit of like a fender bender that's going to get cleared away in the next 35 to 45 minutes. And there's an endless number of issues that can arise. And only by, having kind of an objective truth of what they are, because you have these camera systems and, this map AI that provides the camera intelligence, can you actually understand what the heck is going on? In addition to just like being able to update the map more frequently, stuff like that at a much, much lower cost. So we will definitely do it. but we're not going to do it this year. Probably do it next year as this new device that we're building ramps up.
I want to focus a little bit more on that because I think you've done a good job of explaining the markets that you're going after and therefore the people that are going to use this data and what they're going to use it for. Can you explain to me again, like just spend a little bit more time on why I would choose you over Google, for example? What is your competitive advantage, or how are you now or going to be different to some of these other platforms that are providing similar services today?
Yeah.
You talked about motion and eyes, but could you just put that together for me, please?
Sure. So look, there's two parts of this. One is I'm going to refer to as just like map maintenance, right? So the world is constantly changing, right? Speed limits change, turn restriction, rules change. There's new stop signs that are introduced, drive paths, right? Like a lane goes from 2 lanes to 3 lanes, and now this lane is like a specialized lane for bikes or something else, right? The world is just constantly changing around us. In keeping up with that change is very, very, very hard for products like Google Maps and Waze. Why? Because they are trying to infer from their motion data primarily what the heck is going on. Google Street View, obviously, they pull and extract data from their Google Street View imagery, but Google Street View is at best, every 14 to 18 months, right? Is the frequency of updates. So what does that mean? That means is for just the basic map maintenance, understanding how roads and signs and traffic navigations are changing, Google day to day is effectively blind to all of those changes that are happening, or they're relying upon humans to like report things, right, through like an interface, which is very subjective, very noisy data. Okay, so that's one way we're different in terms of just basic map maintenance and understanding what changes.
Would it be fair to say that, so if you had to summarize that, so you are measurement as opposed to inference?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. That's an excellent way of saying it. By the way, like, don't just trust me. Like, all of minus Google, most of the major mapping companies are using Hivemapper data,
Oh.
right? I mean, Here has publicly said that they're using us, but they're not the only ones, right? And so I think what they're saying is that this approach in terms of map maintenance makes a ton of sense because it's high precision. It has the combination of being, like we talked about, highly positional accurate, but also it has the imagery associated with it. So you don't have to trust like what our object detections are telling you. If you want to verify for yourself, here's the associated imagery. Look for yourself to tell you that like, hey, that turn restriction sign is now been introduced and it's now like you can't make a turn between 4 and 6 p.m. or whatever it is, right? So that's one area where we're fundamentally different from them. The other area where we're fundamentally different from them is this kind of real-time eyes, right? Like we understand what the heck is going on at a given location. And we talked about some of those, right? Like toll price changes, right? Speeding limit changes are dynamic, right? All those signs. But there's a lot of other dynamic events that happen, right? There's an event that just got let out, and as a result of that event getting let out, now this road and that road and this road are all closed, right? Or there was a police activity over here, and so therefore there's like the traffic is all backed up, and there's like 4 cop scenes on the side of the road, and like it's freaking mayhem. Like we can see that stuff and start to understand it, and all these things have different ramifications. Like a little accident that usually gets cleared in 35 minutes versus like a 4-car crash with, ambulances and everything. That's not going to get cleared very quickly.
So I understand what you're saying. Give me an idea of the kind of density, the kind of coverage you need, and perhaps a city like LA to achieve this kind of stuff. Are we there now, or what do we need to do to get there? What needs to happen?
Yeah. So we are there in a couple of cities. We're there in Singapore. We're there in Amsterdam. We're there in Taipei. We're there in certain parts of LA, but not all of LA. LA region is massive. It's about 100,000 road kilometers. So it's quite large. In order to achieve like full density in LA, you probably need 3,000 to 4,000 active daily devices.
Right. Yeah.
And like devices, generally speaking, you want them to be like more commercially oriented, like people who are on the road a lot versus like people like you and me who maybe only, spend 45 minutes to an hour in a car.
So are we talking about Uber drivers, taxi drivers,
Yeah, exactly.
couriers?
Yeah, exactly. FedEx drivers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers. We have a company that is traveling nurses. We have another company that is telecom service equipment. We have another company that is a pest control business. So yeah, all of those types of, I mean, there are people who are out on the road because their job requires them to be out on the road.
Right. Okay. Whew. If you look at the trajectory today, how long before we get there? How long before you get that kind of coverage in LA, or let's think about the States. I guess you're most familiar with the States. Before you get that kind of coverage in all the major centers in the States, in terms of time frame, do you think?
I think if you look at like maybe the top 10, 15 metros in the United States, probably end of next year, we'll have density to kind of do all the layers of the map.
Wow. You've come a long way. You've come a long way.
It's been crazy. It's been a wild ride.
So we talked about, right at the start of the conversation, you were talking about the technological leaps you had to make to get this thing to work, but you also talked about the cultural. And one of the big things was like, it needs to be passive. It needs to be really easy. And you even talked about like even just the act of getting people to plug in their cell phone, and hang it up in front of the dash somehow. It's not passive. They just take it down again, go home, upload the data. I guess something like that. It wasn't passive enough. They need something that just perhaps turns on when they turn on the car and just works, and they don't have to think about it. What was the big unlock in terms of like selling this stuff, getting these drivers to buy in? How did you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think it was a couple things. One is, the device itself had to be like provide utility to the driver. I think that's pretty important. And if they don't provide utility to the driver, then it's just a pure mapping device. And
So what could that utility be?
so in our case, it's about safety and security, right? Like if you're an Uber driver, you're a Lyft driver, you're even a FedEx driver. If you get into an accident and it's not your fault, you want real time imagery or video, ideally, of that issue, right? So that you can then send it to your insurance company and be like, look, this was not my fault. And the reason why that's so important is if either there's no fault, right? It's kind of shared fault because you don't have any evidence to support your claims, then your insurance rates can get jacked up 50, sometimes 100%. And so all of a sudden, that takes a pretty significant bite out of your monthly income.
Okay, so the device you've created is not just a mapping device; it's a general purpose dash cam as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't like the term dash cam because of like the hardware components inside of it are very different than it. But yes, you're correct 1,000%. It smells and looks like, as I like to say, it smells and looks like a dash cam, but inside of it, it's not a dash cam.
Yeah, I realize I'm overgeneralizing when I say that.
No,
What about the crypto side of it, this incentive side of it?
Yeah.
When you go to people, do they buy into it because they just want to do mapping? They want to participate because they need a dash cam anyway, so why not do this as well? Or because there's that sort of incentive through crypto?
There's in the early days that incentive was definitely pretty strong and very helpful in terms of like, oh yeah, I want this like cryptocurrency, and this is like, oh, this is cool. I can like help map the world, and this makes a lot of sense to me, and like maps are something that I use, and like that's pretty valuable to me. And so I think they kind of put all the pieces together, and they're like, I want to be a participant in this for sure. I would say there's three categories of people. There's the crypto enthusiast, there's the mapping enthusiast, and then there's the people who are just like, I got a business to run and this is like useful to me. Like mapping is kind of fun and cool, but like that's not the thing that I'm here for really. Crypto's kind of nice and like that's the icing on the cake if that ever happens, but like I'm actually just need the utility and the value of this tool. And so I think those are broadly speaking the three categories, and they kind of shift over time, right? Like the number of like just pure crypto people as a percentage like wanes over time, and then it's like, oh yeah, the people who are like want to help build a map and are kind of bored and this is kind of fun and all that, they take on a bigger percentage. And then it's just like more and more of like the people is like, oh, this is actually just very useful to me. So that, right now I think it's like maybe one third, one third, one third.
Interesting. So I'm thinking about your journey and how far you've come, again, starting off with drones and where you're at now, building your own hardware and trying to get this density that you're talking about, which just sounds incredible. What has been the biggest takeaway? I know you've had other startups in the past. What has been the biggest takeaway from this one, from Hivemapper?
I think persistence matters. There's definitely I mean, look, I was at Yahoo at a pretty interesting time when there's a lot of really smart people around me, incredibly talented people around me who I had I'm fortunate to work with. And some of them have tried startups. Some of them have worked out well and some of them haven't. I think the things that have definitely set apart, not 100% of the time, but in general, just persistence. I'm just going to make sure that this thing works. Come hell or high water, it's going to work. And I'm going to find a path to make it work. I think that's really underrated, quite frankly, by everybody. You could be the smartest person in the world. You could be the most technical person in the world. You could be the best communicator in the world, but fundamentally, if you don't have that persistence, at some point, shit's going to get really, really hard. And, more likely than not, you're going to give up because most sane people do give up.
Yeah. And I like that approach as well, because it means that it's not just up to luck. Because this is an approach everyone can take. Everyone can be persistent if they want to.
Yeah.
And if that's the thing that's going to help get them through, awesome. Otherwise, it's kind of up to luck. Are you lucky or unlucky? What makes a good problem to go after? So you've chosen a big problem.
Yeah.
Do you have any way of sort of summarizing, for the people listening to this that think, oh, I would like to do something like that, or maybe just are looking for an insight to why go after this problem and what makes a good problem? What's a good market to go after, do you think? Is there any sort of overarching, I don't know, trends or?
Yeah. I think all startups are really, really hard, right? It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're trying to go from 0 to 1, I think it's really hard. You got to be able to convince other people to go down this journey with you. There's a lot of other very stable companies that people could be working for. It's a very competitive job market. It's hard to raise capital. It's hard to get customers on board. It's all hard, right? And so people always say oh, I'm looking for I don't think they're saying this seriously, but there's no easy startup out in the world, right? Even if you're building, let's say, I don't know, B2B SaaS CRM for accountants. I'm just making something up. You would say, oh, that's easy, right? Just a bunch of accountants, CRM tools, whatever. Look, trying to convince an accountant to get over and use your tool, that's probably still pretty hard. Anyways, the point there is that it's all really, really hard. So my view is pick something where if it's has the impact that you hope it has, that impact will be really, really large on a global level, right? Even if it's not a global level, but it will just have a massive impact. That's my view, right? Because it's not oh, if you choose an easier thing, it's going to be less hard. I think that's kind of not true. And I think people kind of believe that inherently, but I think it's it's fundamentally not true. And so I think you're better off trying to go for something really big and really impactful that if it works, it's holy shit, that's incredible.
Because it's all, yeah, because getting back to your point there, if everything is equally hard, if it's all hard, why not pick something that's really gonna change things?
Exactly.
If I just build it, should I just wait for them to come? If I'm persistent with my building, will they just show up?
No. They don't show up, unfortunately. I wish it was that way. Yeah, I mean, you got to go after the customers, right? I mean, it was funny. A friend of mine who's an entrepreneur sold his company to. He was in the travel business. He was I think that was his first startup. He sold his company to another travel business. And so after the acquisition got complete, and it was not a huge acquisition, maybe 10, 15, $20 million, that kind of thing. But anyways, once it was done, he goes, the person the company that bought him said, you know what, your competitor has 10x the amount of traffic that you have. And he's like, what? He's like, that's the shittiest product ever. But the point there is that the other competitor had actually figured out growth hacks or growth in general to the point where even though they had a pretty shitty product, their distribution and their growth strategy and all these things that they had done was so much better than what he had that it fundamentally changed his perspective in terms of how to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think it is generally true that not 100%, but I think it's broadly true that a startup's job, startups generally have better products than incumbents. In some vector, they're 10x better, right? Or 5x better. And then their challenge is how do they get distribution faster than incumbents get a good product.
Yeah.
And it's like that's fundamentally the race.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think that's generally true. There's probably some specific cases where that may not be true.
Yeah, but we're talking in general terms here, and I think that's one of the things that's overlooked. Is that distribution side of it. People just assume if they have something better, they will show up, and they won't. And I think they underestimate how difficult distribution is, like to get your idea to spread. Again, I think that's another side of things where you have to be incredibly persistent, because you can tell someone once and they won't care. You know what I mean? It's that persistence also in talking about what you're doing and believing in what you're doing and getting people to care about it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Hey, Ariel, this has been fantastic. I really admire your persistence. I really admire what you're doing. You just seem to be unstoppable with this, man. Like, it's cool. I hope people take the time to swing by Hivemapper and check it out. And yeah, I really appreciate your time. Cheers. Thanks for coming on again.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. This has been fun. This has been a lot of fun.
Cheers, mate. Bye. Thank you very much for sticking with me all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. I mentioned in the introduction that Hivemapper is worth checking out. So again, we covered a lot of ground in this episode, went into a lot of details, but it's hard to get the visual side of this. It's hard to see the extent of the urban environment that has already been mapped. So it is worth Googling Hivemapper, searching for it, and having a look at the map yourself. I still think this is a fascinating idea, and I will be following their progress throughout the next few years as well. Thanks very much for tuning in all the way to the end. Much appreciated. I'll see you again soon. Bye.